Good afternoon, and welcome to our session. The topic is, well, the title is The British Are Coming, but I'm going to call it, the topic is the American Revolution and the events surrounding it. I first encountered the work of Gordon Wood when I was, maybe a late undergraduate, early graduate student. And what year did the Radicalism of the American Revolution come out?
92, I think.
Okay, so it was, I think it's the single best book written on the American Revolution. And it makes the argument, so this is something that historians have talked about for a long time. How revolutionary was the American Revolution? It's of a different sort, say, than the French Revolution. Much less bloody in terms of the blood spilled among the populace. Of course, there was a large war surrounding the American Revolution. But people have debated, so how revolutionary was it? And Gordon Wood made the argument that the American Revolution was pretty radical, and that was the radicalism of the American Revolution. So my first question to you is, this book came out, as you say, 30 years ago or so.
Right.
So how radical was the American Revolution? And do you still think what you did back then?
Well, I still think it's pretty radical. Of course, it starts as an imperial crisis, a breakup of the North America breaking away from the British Empire, and like a colonial rebellion, maybe not all that different from the way the Algerians broke away from France in the 1960s. It starts as an imperial crisis. It results in a war that went on for 8 years, until recently the longest war in our history. But it unleashes forces. In 1776, with the Declaration and then the creation of 13 independent states, which are republics now, no longer under a monarchy, social forces are released, particularly in the North, that turn this imperial revolution, or this imperial breakup, into a middle-class revolution. Middle-class people begin using the ideology of the revolution, equality, liberty, to promote their own middle-class interests. And this transforms the imperial breakup into what I would call a radical middle-class revolution that has astonishing effects in social and cultural terms through the whole antebellum period. And of course separates the sections in a fundamental way, because the North becomes dedicated to working. One of the things I made a great deal of was the changing conception of labor. Up to the 18th century and up to the American Revolution, work or labor was considered mean and despicable. From Aristotle on, people who had to work with their hands, are considered lowly and fit actually only for slaves. And until the early 19th century in the United States, work is transformed into a positive good, something to be celebrated, not scorned, and that turns the North into a very different kind of place, as you can well imagine, from a slave-ridden South. Slavery and work are connected in the Southerners' minds, and that the slaves are the ones who do the work. And gentlemen are to be free of that kind of labor. In the North, work is celebrated, and the term gentleman becomes really attached to everybody. When Harriet Martineau from England comes to the United States and she travels in the North, she's stunned to find that everybody seems to be a gentleman. Even tavern keepers and people who wield picks and shovels are gentlemen. When Tocqueville comes in the 1830s, he's stunned to find out, because he spends most of his time in the North, to find out that people are really obsessed with money, because money becomes the great source of distinction. Now, you can say, well, that's not very nice, is it? But if you think about the old regime, the ancien regime, where your your ancestry, or where you were born, or who were your ancestors, was your source of distinction, then money becomes a great leveler. It becomes an equalizer. If you can make more money than someone, then you are you're superior, but that person is not really inferior because he can work hard and make the same amount of money. That notion is what surprises Tocqueville, and he's overwhelmed by this kind of money-making democracy. And of course, in the South, they come to realize that they are the holding on to the traditional view that of gentility, and that they are the cavalier image of the South, and the North are a bunch of money-hungry Yankees. And the sectional division becomes aggravated in the course of this middle-class revolution. So that's what's radical about it. I've never been able to convince all my colleagues of that, but I'm glad to hear that Bill here agrees with me.
So you use the term middle class.
Right.
And you say that the middle class gets into this imperial crisis and they carry the revolution forward in a different direction than the people who came before perhaps had in mind. Can you identify what kind of occupations were middle class? Even maybe, are there individuals that we would recognize, that you would identify as part of this middle class takeover of the nationalist revolt against imperial rule?
Yeah, let me focus on one particular guy that I like, a man named William Finley. He comes over as I think his background was, he was a weaver, came from Northern Ireland, and takes advantage of America. He's from Western Pennsylvania. He runs for the state legislature of Pennsylvania, the colonial legislature actually, before it's a state, and wins a seat in the Pittsburgh area. He's never been to college. He has no college education, but he's a very smart guy. And he becomes a promoter of paper money. He becomes a promoter of the kinds of things that the elite don't like. And the elite would, and I mean someone like James Madison or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson would define Finley as one of those narrow-minded, parochial, illiberal men who are creating the problems that arise as a consequence of the revolution. This is exactly what James Madison, this kind of person, was exactly the kind of person he did not like and that he was trying to deal with, because the state legislatures, which in 1776 become annually elected in all the states, that's an innovation, not only in the world, but in the United States. Only in New England had they had annual elections. The state legislatures are greatly expanded. The suffrage is as large as any place in the world. In fact, there's no place that even comes close. The British had 1 out of 6 adult males who could vote. In America, it's much closer to 2 out of 3, which there's no suffrage like that anywhere else in the world. So it's the most democratic state legislatures you can imagine. They begin passing a whole series of laws. James Madison is concerned about this, and he writes a paper. If you are interested in this, you can call it up on your iPad. It's called The Vices of the Political System of the United States. It's a working paper. It was never published. It's his working paper as he formulates his plans for revising the Articles of Confederation. He wants something that will somehow deal with these runaway legislatures, which he calls the excesses of democracy. Too many people like William Finley are gaining power and passing these kinds of laws. He talks about the mutability, meaning the changeability of the laws, the multiplicity, more laws, he says, are passed since 1776. He's talking in 1 decade than have been passed in the entire colonial period. A host of new interests are coming into the legislature, and they're passing all this legislation, and much of the legislation is unjust. Paper money is being issued by these state legislatures, and paper money is devastating to creditors. As you know, inflated currency, people lend money, as George Washington complained, I lend money out in gold and silver, and I'm getting it back in a piece of paper that's worth only a portion of what that gold and silver was. These are the problems that lie behind the making of the Constitution. William Finley is an opponent of the Constitution. But he does not understand what's going to go on in Philadelphia, because everybody, I would say by 1786, everyone in the nation had agreed that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate to the needs of the nation. Now, the Articles are a treaty. It's a league. It's very similar to the EU. If you can think about Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia coming together like England, France, and Germany and Holland in the recent times, that's exactly what the Articles were about. Everyone agreed that those Articles needed the taxing power and also the power to regulate trade. Madison, in effect, hijacks that reform and instead of adding amendments to the Articles, scraps them entirely and creates an entirely new government, which no one in 1776 anticipated. In their wildest dreams, they could not have imagined that they would ever be under a strong central government like the one that was created by the Constitution. So something awful had to happen to change people's minds. And it's an elite change, and Madison represents that. And he talks about in this Vices essay, which, as I say, you can call it up. It's not very long. It's only about 5 or 6 pages. It's his notes. This is what's wrong with America, why we have to do what we're doing. And he outlines these excesses of democracy promoted by what he calls illiberal, parochial, narrow-minded men. And he's going to create a government. Now, he could have worked towards a monarchy. And many people suggested, look, that's the solution. If you've got a republic that's run wild, you better have an alternative. The best alternative would be to create a monarchy. And many people wanted George Washington to become a king. And Madison says, no, I'm not going to go in that direction. I'm going to have a Republican remedy for Republican ills. That's what he says in the Federalist Papers. And that's his conception of the Constitution. Now, he had all kinds of plans, the Virginia plan. It didn't quite work out in the convention the way he wanted. He wanted the Congress to be given a veto over all state legislation. That would be, imagine if that had stayed in. It would mean that all the states, 50 states, would be sending their bills into Washington to be hearings to be held whether they should have been vetoed or not. Well, obviously, that was so impractical. It's amazing that he didn't think of that it was, but he was insistent on it. And instead, we have Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which is a series of prohibitions on what the states can do. They can't pass tariffs, and they can't issue money, print money. Now, if that had been enforced rigidly, the antebellum economy would have been stifled. Well, the states get around that prohibition because there's no federal issuing of money. The states get around that prohibition by chartering banks, hundreds of them, which in turn issued the paper money. And that paper money becomes the capital that allows particularly the North, to flourish in the antebellum period. But that, in short, that's a description of what happened lying behind the Constitution. The convention was a loaded convention. It was made up of mostly elites. Finley is asked by his state legislature, would you like to go to this convention in Philadelphia? He's in Pittsburgh. He said, will you pay my way? And they say, no, you're going to have to pay yourself. He says, well, I couldn't live there for, he doesn't know how long it's going to last, but he said, I couldn't live there for weeks and weeks. Well, it was 4 months. And he doesn't have the money to do this, so he doesn't go. But he doesn't know what's going to happen. He's stunned, as many others were stunned by the Constitution that comes out of Philadelphia. It's not what they bargained for. It's not what they expected. But so the ratification fight is a real fight and very, very close in many states. But as one anti-federalist said, it's this or nothing, because by that time the Articles had collapsed. And you either have to have this government that's proposed or we go into chaos and the whole country would fall apart. So the Constitution is approved, but very narrowly in some of the states.
If I might ask a question about the relationship between the two great charters of America's origin, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. One of the things I point out to my students is the Declaration of Independence has been widely emulated, plagiarized, borrowed from, stolen by other countries as they declared their own independence. And this story culminates in one respect at the end of World War II when Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnamese communists, got in touch with the local leader, the local head of the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, that had been helping the Vietnamese communists fight against the Japanese during the war. And he said, can you get me a copy of the American Declaration of Independence? I want to use it as the model for a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. So that's the Declaration of Independence. And its language, especially all men are created equal, is something that resonates with all sorts of people around the world, and also its origin in this anti-colonial rebellion of the Americans against the British. And in the anti-colonial rebellions against the British, the French, Italians, and everybody else after the Second World War, this became very popular. The American Revolution against Britain became the model of the Latin American revolutions against Spain in the early 19th century. So the American Declaration of Independence has really resonated with the rest of the world. The U.S. Constitution is quite different. And it's hard to find a constitution of any other country in the world that looks very much like the U.S. Constitution. So this is, I think, sort of food for thought. Why is this so? And I want to put the question this way. So one of the reasons that the U.S. Constitution is the way it is that, as you mentioned, there were these 13 states that had 13 independent republics that had already written their constitutions before this federal constitution was written. The Articles of Confederation was, as you point out, was not a constitution. It was this confederation. It was a treaty. Okay, so we get this constitution, and in American politics today, and for the last 200 years, when you speak about the Constitution, everybody knows you're talking about the federal Constitution. So in the Federalist Papers and among the supporters of the federal Constitution, an argument develops that this federal system, where you have these two levels of government, you have the state governments that deal with domestic local issues, and then above this system you have the federal government. Well, people understood in the debate over the Constitution that this country was asking for trouble with this, because there certainly would come time when you wouldn't know whether the states had the final say on this issue or the federal government had a final say on this issue. And of course, it was this problem, in conjunction with the institution of slavery, that ultimately gave rise to secession and the Civil War, as the southern states, in defense of slavery, claimed the right to leave the Union. It was their sovereign right as states. So my question to you is, and given this and the fact that there haven't been many other takers to reproduce the U.S. Constitution, was this something that they just made do with? If James Madison had his way and could start with a clean slate where the states didn't have their own constitutions, would he have written a constitution that's more like the Constitution of France or the de facto Constitution of Britain, where it's really clear that the national government is sovereign, and just as, well, state governments. State governments are sovereign within their states, and they typically farm out responsibilities to cities. But in the end, it's state law that prevails. So if James Madison could have had his way, would he have designed things that way? Or did he really believe in the argument that this is the best of all worlds?
Well, he was a realist and one of the shrewdest politicians, of course, among the founders. Certainly much shrewder, I think, than Hamilton or Washington or even Jefferson. He was stuck with the reality. These states are real states. I mean, when Jefferson talked about my country, he didn't mean United States. He meant Virginia. Just the way Macron, when he talks about my country, he really isn't thinking about Europe. He's thinking about France. I don't care how much of an internationalist or cosmopolitan he is. So, and when John Adams talked about my country, he meant Massachusetts. So you have to understand that in 1776, these are the realities. Madison is trying to break that up in a sense. Now, there were people at the convention who would like to have destroyed the states, that is, to make them administrative units, break them up, get away from this state sovereignty. But that was so unrealistic, given the nature of people's loyalties and so on. Some of these states went back 100 years. The loyalty was, the emotional attachment to Virginia or to Massachusetts or to Pennsylvania was deep. So that's the problem that all of these founders have with the new government. How are you going to make it stick? How can you make them? And of course, it's not easy, as the Civil War showed. So he's a realist. He says, well, we're going to keep the states, but we're going to create this super government that will act as a kind of umpire over the disputes that take place. Now, he actually says this government will play the same role that the king ideally was supposed to play in the old empire. Now, he uses that term, and it's kind of out of touch with reality itself, because when the government is formed, Hamilton and Washington are the two leaders in the administration. Hamilton has a very different program. This helps explain Madison's shift. You see, in the 1780s, he sees the problem coming from the states. As I say, they're running amok, democracy running amok, creating all of these problems. We're going to create a federal government that's going to solve or try to deal with these problems. When he gets to the 1790s, so the states are the problem in the 90s, in the 80s, with the federal government the solution. In the 1790s, the federal government becomes the problem, and he sees the states as a solution, like the Virginia Resolution of 1798, which is, along with Jefferson's Kentucky Resolution, is designed to deal with the runaway federal government. So Madison switches. Well, why does he switch? Because the government that emerges under Hamilton's leadership is not at all what he thought in mind. Hamilton has an image of the government becoming like a European state, and Washington buys into it. Hamilton says to Washington, this is the kind of government we're going to have. It's going to be like Great Britain's. It's going to have a stock market, it's going to have a bank, it's going to have a credit system, and it's going to have a standing army, a standing navy, and in 4 or 5 decades, we will be so strong that no nation in Europe will dare take us on. We can deal with any nation militarily on their terms. Well, that's not at all what Madison and Jefferson had in mind. They wanted an agrarian republic, not at all a strong, no army, no navy, none of that. We're going to rely on the militia. So that's the division of the 1790s. And Madison goes into opposition and creates the Republican Party in opposition to the Federalists. That is Washington and Hamilton, and John Adams is the vice president. That's the division that emerges in the 1790s because simply differs so much from Madison's vision of what he wanted with his Virginia plan. As I say, he wanted an umpire. If you read the Federalist 10, which is probably the most famous paper in the Federalist Papers, it's full of, and this is written by Madison, it's full of adjudicatory images. A man cannot be a judge in his own cause, and legislation is a kind of judgment, and these people are passing laws in their own interest. Well, of course, by today's standards, it seems so naive. Of course people go into office to pass laws in accordance with their own interests. He wants something different. He imagines something different. He imagines people being disinterested and not the product of constituents or special interests. And we still have that hope that somehow the office holders will be disinterested, meaning impartial, and not, in fact, the word disinterested is dropped out. We use it as a synonym for uninterested. For them, that was not the meaning. The 18th century meaning of disinterested was impartial, standing above interests. And we've lost that because we don't really believe anybody can be disinterested. I think the only people we left in our society that we think are truly disinterested are sports umpires and referees. Everyone else has an interest. And we just count on the referees being really disinterested. And if we lose that, then a whole multi-billion-dollar industry goes down the tubes. Anyway, that's the dream, I think, that Madison had.
I want to back the story up a little bit from what happens in the 1780s and 1790s to the 1770s. And in particular, this question of why some people became revolutionaries and other people did not. And there are famous examples of this. Perhaps one of the best, you've written about Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin he became a leader of the revolutionaries, which was a striking thing because he was 70 years old when he became a revolutionary. Usually revolution is thought of as a young man's game. And he was a septuagenarian when he decided to turn his back on the on the British Empire, which he conceived to be the greatest thing going in the world. And so it took him a long time and a great deal of emotional anguish to make this decision that he was going to split with the British Empire and endorse American independence. His son, however, remained loyal to the British Empire to the last, and there was this rift in the Franklin household. So, and I should point out that this was within a single family, but in very many ways, the American Revolution as this military contest could be thought of as America's first civil war, because much of the fighting, indeed the most bitter fighting, took place not between American troops and British troops, but between American troops and American troops, between the Whigs and the Tories, the Patriots and the Loyalists. So, how do you go about trying to explain why someone like William Franklin would remain loyal to Britain? And I should point out that for the Loyalists, they thought that their position did not require explaining. They were simply steady as we go. William Franklin was born an Englishman. He would live and die an Englishman. His father was born an Englishman, but died an American. And in a very basic legalistic sense, until essentially the 4th of July in 1776, you could have a reasonably polite conversation about whether the United States should try to mend things with Britain, except it wasn't called the United States, that the colonies could mend things with Britain, or that they need to break out on their own. But then comes the American Declaration of Independence, which makes these states independent, and the states began passing laws essentially proscribing the Loyalists, allowing their jailing in some cases, the seizure of their property.
Right.
And many of the Loyalists felt that they had been betrayed. But of course, the Patriots, they are the ones who called the Loyalists the traitors. And it was a very confusing thing. Do you have any thoughts on who became a patriot, who remained a Loyalist?
Right. Well, there's a lot of literature on this. And the best estimate is about 20% of the population was probably Loyalist. That would be about, 500,000 people. And of these, about 80,000 or so left, exiles, left the country when in 1775, 76, escaping from Whig or Patriot pressure. In the case of Franklin, his son, of course, was governor of New Jersey, largely through the influence of his father, who spent from 1757, he went over to London to try to convince the Crown to make Pennsylvania, which was a proprietary colony under the control of the Penn family, into a royal colony. That is, he wanted to royalize it so it would have a royal governor. He was very loyal to the empire. He comes back only for a short time in the middle of the 60s to look after his post office. He was the chief postmaster of the colonies. And he goes back to England. So from 1757 to 1775, he is in London. He is totally out of touch with colonial opinion. The Stamp Act, he's not very happy about it because it's going to tax newspapers, and he was, of course, making a lot of money from newspapers, and he didn't like it. He opposed it, but of course, once it's passed, he writes his colleague back home, John Hughes, and says, well, look, empires cost money, we got to pay this tax. And he wrangles the stamp agency for John Hughes, almost cost Hughes his life because all the stamp agents were mobbed and all of them were forced to resign, and no stamps except a few in Georgia were ever issued because of mob pressure on the stamp agents. So Franklin comes very late to the revolution. In fact, if the British had been smart, this is my take on this, in 1774 or so, they would have, 1772 or 3, they would have made him, they created a new department. I'm sorry, in 1767, they finally wake up to the fact that North America is important. We better have a cabinet department for North America. Up to that time, the colonies were being handled by the Secretary of State for Southern Europe, out of his back pocket, so to speak. Well, they finally decided they should have an American department, and he would not be appointed to the secretary because these were all lords who were running but he was hoping he would be the chief secretary, and they passed him over. I think if the British had given him that post, he might have remained loyal. What happens is that he gets involved in something called the Hutchison Papers. He releases some documents. It's very much like the present in that sense. These are secret letters that Thomas Hutchison, the governor of Massachusetts, had written to colleagues back home, and he makes this mistake of saying, America, we must curb some American liberties to deal with this crisis. Well, that gets exposed. Hutchison's tenure is ruined. And the government turns on Franklin in a vicious attack in the cockpit. For an hour, he's attacked by the Solicitor General, I think. And his post office is taken away. And he's supposed to have walked out and turned to the prosecutor saying, your master will pay for this. That may be apocryphal. At any rate, he becomes a really angry man. And he stays a while longer thinking, because William Pitt consults with him. Pitt, being a very great English hero, tries to make a final deal to keep the colonies together. And Franklin helps engineer it. But his days are numbered. And Franklin escapes and in March of 75, and he was about to be arrested, and gets back, and he becomes a flaming patriot. And so much of a patriot that people are puzzled. They think he might be a mole. In fact, William Bradford, who was a classmate of Madison's at Princeton, writes to him and says, look, we think this guy, Mr. Franklin, he's celebrated. He's the most famous American in the world. And they're a little suspicious of him because he spent so much time in England. He said, we're not sure he's loyal. And Franklin realizes this, so he writes a letter to his good friend, whose name now escapes me, and he says to him, you more or less says, you've got blood on your hands. You are now my enemy, and I am yours, Benjamin Franklin. That's how he ends the letter. And he lets people see this letter, July 5th of 1775, but he never sends it. He writes a very warm letter the next day to his friend. He wants to convince them that he's broken his ties. And so Bradford writes another letter to Madison and saying, well, I think we now change our opinion. Franklin seems to be loyal to us, the patriot cause. Now, that's my take on Franklin. He becomes more patriotic than anyone else. I mean, people are stunned. And he turns against his son, disowns him. He's really angry. His son after the war, wants to get together and make amends. Franklin will have nothing to do with him. He is so bitter about his son not following him. Now, the Loyalists you've heard about tarring and feathering. They are intimidated everywhere. And the only way they can make any stand is with royal troops present. And when the Royal Army moves into New Jersey, they come out of the woodwork and they begin exacting revenge against the patriots. And so you have a lot of, in the Hackensack Valley in New Jersey, there's a terrific militia fighting, what we would call guerrilla warfare, that doesn't usually get into the history books because it's not organized armies. But as soon as and that's because General Howe, the British, spreads his army all over, and he allows these loyalists to come out of the hiding. But when you have the Battle of Trenton, when Washington crosses the Delaware and seizes that small little post there. It's a very important victory. And Howe gets nervous because he's got all these outposts and they're going to be picked off. So he pulls his army back. And of course, then the Patriots come out, their militia comes out, and they really destroy the Loyalist forces. The Loyalists never have enough support. There's only about, as I say, 20% at best. And they're located in South Carolina. There's vicious guerrilla fighting. In the Carolinas, that goes on a long time. But in New England, there's very few Loyalists. Virginia has almost no Loyalists. When Burgoyne comes down the Hudson Valley, he counts on Loyalist support. It's just not there. And he keeps losing his army to little militia. They're picking him off. And he's finally confronted with a Patriot army and gets defeated and has to surrender his army of about 5,000 or 6,000 men. So the Loyalists never have enough support, and they're intimidated everywhere. And the only way they could have any support is when the royal troops are there. So that's my take on the Loyalists. The Loyalists, of course, are hurt badly, and the English tries to compensate them at the end of the war, and there's a big struggle to how much did you lose, and they submit their losses to the British government, and only about, I think, 2,000 Loyalists, a very small fraction, get compensated for their losses.
So you've suggested that the Loyalists really didn't have a chance to win, but I want to take the question a little bit more broadly. Those of us in the historical profession, or maybe I should just speak for myself, tend to spend all of our time explaining things that did happen. It's a big job, but not always asking, was this thing bound to happen? Could it have happened differently? So, and for something as earth-shaking as American independence, the American Revolution, the creation of the American National Republic, and so on, it is tempting, especially if you're in favor of the way things turned out, to suppose that it was inevitable and a good thing that it did. Were there any, but I would frame the question a little bit differently. Every big event is, at least in part, the sum of lots of little events.
Right.
And so if the British, for example, had handled Benjamin Franklin differently,
Yes.
would he have been on a different side when the revolution broke out? I sometimes take Benjamin Franklin and George Washington as the bellwethers of British misgovernment. Because Benjamin Franklin was, as Gordon suggested, the most famous American. He's the only American that you could guarantee you would have ever heard of, we would have ever heard of now, if there had been no American Revolution. He was world famous before all these events. He was a scientist, a philosopher, and so on. George Washington was one of the most successful, distinguished, respected men in the American colonies. These two individuals should have been pillars of the status quo, but they became revolutionaries. And I sometimes thought that if the British could somehow manage to alienate Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, they deserved to lose the American colonies.
Well,
but is it, I mean, how much of it is misgovernment?
Yeah, it's true that no events are inevitable, except when you look at the little decisions that are made. You can make a good case for the British. They'd just gone through this 7 years war, or what we call the French and Indian War, on behalf of the American colonies. I mean, in other words, the French were trying to take over the West. The French and the English had fought several wars through the 18th century. This is the first time that the major theater of the fight between these two Goliath states in Europe had taken place in North America. Now, the English win, and they kick the French out of North America, presumably forever. I mean, it's a massive victory, but it cost a lot of money. And the British officers going back home said, you know, those Americans, they're living in a land of milk and honey. It's a pretty prosperous place there. And it's true. America was very prosperous. Demographically, we were reproducing our population faster than the English. And we had a higher standard of living probably in the world, in the colonies, despite slavery. So from the English point of view, they say, well, we got all these we got this enormous debt now from the war, and our own people are being taxed to their limit. In fact, they tried to impose a cider tax and in the apple growing counties of England, and there were riots. And so they said, well, shouldn't we get some money from the Americans? You can see from their point of view, it's made entire sense to have this stamp tax, which was going to just be very small little tax on paper products. Well, this precipitated mobs and boycotts, and the English retreat. It was not easy for Parliament. You have to understand the importance of Parliament in English thinking. It's the great bastion of liberty. For Parliament to pass a law and then a year later take it back, wow, that was very difficult. So they called in Benjamin Franklin to help ease interviewing him, and he said he made a mistake in the middle of his interview. He says, well, we would object to internal taxes like a stamp tax, but maybe we wouldn't object to an external tax, meaning like a duty on goods coming in. Well, the English picked that. Okay, so Chancellor of the Exchequer Townsend says, well, if they take an extra, he says, I don't see any difference between the two taxes, but if that's what they want, I'm going to give it to them. So the Townsend duties are passed in 1767, a series of taxes on paint and other products, including tea. Again, riots, boycotts, mobbing, and of course they can't collect any of these taxes. So they retreat once more. They repeal. North comes into the government. This is a time of chaos in the English ministers. George III is a new king, and he wants his ministers to be people that he likes. And they're his ministers, and they try to tell him, look, Your Majesty, you can't just appoint anybody as minister. You've got to have the support of Parliament. He says, I don't know what you mean. These are my ministers. In other words, they don't understand cabinet government as it's slowly evolving. This is the beginning stage that we now have in England, where the Queen is a non-entity politically. She gives the speech, but it's really controlled by the ministry. George III is still convinced that these are his ministers. He's going to appoint whom he wants. So we have a lot of confusion. Finally, he finds a minister, Lord North, that he gets along with, and North says, all right, I'll repeal all of these Townsend duties. I'll keep one on tea just to show that we have the right. And that goes along for a couple of years until North, in his wisdom, decides to bail out the East India Company without thinking through the repercussions of this. I'm going to give them a monopoly of selling tea in the colonies. He's not thinking about making a point, not trying to think about, he doesn't think about creating any problems. He thinks this is just a way of solving a problem for the East India Company. But of course, radicals like Samuel Adams are looking for an opportunity like this. And when the tea is landed in Boston, Hutchison, who's governor, says, we're not going to allow this tea to go back. It's going to be unloaded, and unloaded tea will be taxed. Everywhere else, the governor said the tea ships would come into New York, and the governor says, go on back home. We're not going to have a crisis here, because if they tried to unload it and tax it, they knew there would be mobs. So they send the tea back to England, but not in Boston. Governor Hutchison decides he's going to get this money. And so you have the Tea Party. On the night before it's going to be unloaded and therefore taxed, Mohawk Indians, of course, Sam Adams and his boys, disguised as Mohawks, come in and destroy nearly 10,000 pounds money, 2,000 pounds sterling of tea. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Throw it into Boston Harbor. Well, the British are outraged, and so aren't the Virginians, and many people around the colonies. This is destroying private property. This is too much. Those Boston Puritans, they're crazy. And of course, the British now play into the hands of the Patriots by saying, enough is enough. We've appeased these colonists. Look what we did in '65. We passed the Stamp Act, and then we repealed it the next year. Look, in '67, we passed the Townsend duties and repealed it. And now we get this Tea Party destruction of property. We're going to show them who's boss. And they come in with the Coercive Acts. closing the port of Boston, appointing a military governor, calling Hutchison back, appointing a military man, general, as governor, doing away the town meetings, appointing the council, which was at that point had been elected in Massachusetts. All of a sudden, George Washington and the other Virginians say, hey, if they can do that to Massachusetts, they can do that to us. And I think at that moment, the revolution is inevitable. In fact, a new book is coming out by Mary Beth Norton in 2 months, entitled 1774. And her argument is the revolution was already over by 1774. The colonies are virtually independent by that point. Not in name, but in fact. The royal governors are helpless. They're getting on ships. They can't govern. They can't even remain at their post, except for William Franklin, who thinks he's somehow immune, so he gets arrested. He's the only royal governor who was arrested by the Patriots. So in that sense, the revolution is inevitable because so many little decisions were made along the way, which is what happens whenever big events occur. You think back and say, well, if they hadn't done this and they hadn't done that. But from the British point of view, it seemed absolutely logical. They'd had enough. Appeasing, you can imagine the House of Commons, people saying, we've given them everything and look what they've done. And that was the Coercive Acts were the turning point.
We've discovered just now that the game was over in 1774. Our session is over now. Thank you all for coming.